Why did the laughter stop the moment she stopped moving? For a few seconds, no one was sure if she was unconscious or dead. Her body lay half submerged in the mud pit, cheek pressed into freezing Carolina clay, blood threading through the red sludge like ink in water. Rain clung to her lashes. Her chest rose once, then again, slow, controlled. Too controlled for someone who had just been thrown face first into the ground. Around her, 47 Marines stood in a loose circle. Some were grinning. Some looked away. A few shifted uncomfortably, boots sinking into wet earth. Gunnery Sergeant Victor Mercer stood over her, hands on his hips, boots inches from her skull like punctuation at the end of a sentence he believed was final. "Take a bath," someone muttered. Laughter followed, not loud, not cruel enough to feel intentional. The kind that spreads when no one wants to be the first to stop it. She didn't react. Mud crept into her mouth. Cold bit through her uniform. Her nose throbbed with a deep, nauseating pulse that told her something was broken. She catalogued the pain the way she always did, detached, precise. Nasal fracture, possible concussion, hypothermia setting in. She slowed her breathing. This wasn't the first time she'd been on the ground, while people waited for her to stay there. Mercer leaned closer. "This is what happens," he said loudly, projecting for the entire company. "When we lower standards, when we let politics dress up as warriors." No one helped her up. She stayed still long enough for them to believe they had won. Then she planted her palms into the mud and pushed. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Mud peeled off her sleeves. Blood slid down her chin. She rose to one knee, then stood fully upright, spine straight, hands at her sides, eyes fixed on a point beyond Mercer's shoulder as if he didn't exist. The laughter died. Something about her stillness unsettled them. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't pleading. She looked finished, as if a decision had already been made and they simply hadn't been informed yet. Mercer circled her, satisfied, convinced the message had landed. He didn't see the way her fingers brushed briefly against her collarbone, touching the faint outline of a pendant hidden beneath her soaked shirt. He didn't know what it meant. Captain Nathan Voigt did. From the raised platform, Voigt watched her with narrowed eyes. He had reviewed her file 3 times since her arrival. Large sections were redacted, years simply missing, units that didn't exist on paper, deployments without locations. He'd learned long ago what that kind of silence meant. This woman was not who Mercer thought she was. She turned and walked away from the pit without looking back. Every step measured, every movement controlled. 47 Marines watched her go, unaware that the ground had just shifted beneath all of them. And none of them knew that the worst moment of her life wasn't lying in the mud. It was what came after, when she was alone. What does a warrior do when no one is watching? The door clicked shut behind her. Only then did her body betray her. She stripped off her uniform with shaking hands and let it fall in a heap on the tile. Mud, blood, rainwater pooling beneath it. She stood in front of the mirror, breathing hard, staring at a face she barely recognized. Her nose was crooked. Blood had dried along her upper lip. Red clay clung to her hair, her ears, the corners of her eyes. She looked like something dragged out of the ground and left unfinished. Her hands began to shake. Not from the cold, not from adrenaline, from memory. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, breath breaking apart despite everything she knew about control. The tears came fast and ugly, ripping through her with a violence she hadn't allowed herself in years. She cried for the humiliation, for the men who laughed, for the ones who didn't stop it. She cried for the faces she still saw in dreams, for places she could never name, for a father who died alone in the dark while she was thousands of miles away, pretending she was strong enough to be fine. When the sobbing finally burned itself out, she reached up and pulled the pendant from beneath her shirt. Silver, warm from her skin. She turned it over in her palm and read the three words engraved in her father's handwriting. Make them remember. The memory hit her without warning. She was 12 again, standing on a mountain range with a rifle too heavy for her arms, frustrated tears threatening to spill because she'd missed the target. Her father had knelt beside her, voice calm, steady. The world will tell you to stay down when you fail, he'd said, but we don't do that. She had steadied her breathing, adjusted, fired again. Center mass. She wiped her face now, standing slowly. Her nose still throbbed. Her eyes burned, but the shaking was gone. She looked at herself one more time in the mirror. This, she whispered, is not where I stop. Why would a man risk everything just to prove a woman didn't belong? Gunnery Sergeant Mercer sat alone that night, replaying the day in his head. He told himself it was discipline, that it was necessary, that if he didn't draw the line, everything he believed about the Corps would unravel. He didn't question where those beliefs came from. His father had taught him that pain built warriors, that weakness deserved correction, that women existed on the margins of real combat. Mercer had built his entire identity on that foundation. And now, a woman had stood up from the mud and looked through him like he wasn't real. He submitted the recommendation before midnight. Immediate removal, failure to maintain composure, physical deficiency, career over. He slept well. She did not. At 1500 the next day, she stood in Captain Voight's office, nose taped, uniform clean, face unreadable. Voight studied her for a long moment. Did you ever serve with Task Force Reaper? He asked quietly. Her jaw tightened by a fraction. Are you cleared to ask that, sir? Voight almost smiled. He gave her a choice. Leave quietly, or take the advanced infantry assessment. 48 hours, no sleep, no margin. Midnight start. So she didn't hesitate. So when do we begin? What happens when exhaustion strips away everything except truth? The ocean was black when she entered it. Cold hit like a weapon. Her muscles screamed. Her breath fought her. She swam anyway, counting strokes, touching the pendant beneath her wetsuit when doubt crept in. Second place means you survive. She survived. The miles blurred together. Pain became background noise. Hunger, cold, hallucinations. Her father walking beside her, silent, present. By the time she reached the shoot house, she was hollowed out, empty, but steady. And every movement precise, every shot placed with care. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. Oh, she finished. When she stepped into the morning light, 44 hours had passed. She hadn't slept. She hadn't failed. Mercer watched her with a face drained of certainty. This was not supposed to happen. Why did the room go silent when the truth was finally spoken? Captain Voight read the results calmly, professionally. Then he read the rest. Her service, her missions, her father's name. The room didn't breathe. Mercer exploded. Accusations, rage, fear masquerading as authority. Voight shut it down. Sit down. He didn't. She stepped forward instead. He pulled out the pendant and turned it so the words caught the light. Make them remember. Her voice was quiet. My father died protecting others, she said. You hurt people to feel powerful. Mercer had nothing left. When the MPs escorted him out, no one followed. The applause started slowly. Then it filled the room. She stood still, pendant warm against her chest, understanding at last what those words meant. Why did she return to the mud pit before leaving? The ground was frozen. Frost glittered in the early light. She stood at the edge of the pit where it had happened. Not angry, not proud, just aware. A place where someone tried to make her smaller and failed. When she walked away, The frost began to melt. Somewhere behind her, a new generation was waking up. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the silence in that bathroom feel louder than the shouting in the mud pit? The door had barely closed before her control unraveled. Not all at once, never all at once. It started in her hands. A faint tremor she tried to ignore as she reached for the collar of her uniform. Mud cracked and flaked as she peeled the fabric away from her skin. The smell followed her into the small tiled room, wet earth, iron from blood, cold rain trapped in cloth. She locked the door, checked it twice, a habit learned the hard way. Only then did she let herself look. The mirror reflected a version of her she didn't recognize, or maybe one she recognized too well. Her nose sat wrong on her face, shifted just enough to change everything. Dried blood traced an uneven line from her nostril to her lip. Red clay clung to her hairline, her eyelashes, the hollow at the base of her throat. She stared without blinking. This wasn't the first time she'd looked like this. It just felt different now. There were no teammates nearby, no mission clock ticking, no radio crackling with orders, just her, alone, reduced to a body that hurt. Her fingers tightened on the sink. She told herself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow it down. Control the heart rate. The same technique she'd used in places where panic meant death. It didn't work. Her hands began to shake harder. She slid down the wall and sat on the cold tile floor, knees pulled up, forehead resting against them. The sob that escaped her surprised her. It tore out of her chest, raw and uncontrolled, followed by another and another, until her body was heaving with it. She hadn't cried like this in years. She cried for the mud, for the laughter, for the way no one had stopped it. She cried for the look in Mercer's eyes when he'd thrown her down. Not anger, not discipline, but satisfaction. The quiet joy of a man proving something to himself. She cried for the years she'd spent being invisible by design. for missions she could never talk about, for names she wasn't allowed to say out loud, for faces that still visited her in the dark. And finally, she cried for her father. That grief lived deeper than all the others. It was older, heavier. It didn't scream, it pressed, constant, relentless. A weight she carried everywhere, even when she pretended she didn't. She pressed her mouth against her knee to muffle the sound. Even alone, she didn't want anyone to hear her break. When the tears finally slowed, her chest felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out and left behind. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, smearing dried blood across her skin, and laughed once, a quiet, humorless sound. "Get it together," she whispered to no one. Her gaze dropped to her chest. The pendant lay hidden beneath her undershirt, warm against her skin. Her fingers moved to it almost without permission, sliding the chain free and lifting the small silver disc into the light. She turned it over slowly. "Make them remember." The words seemed heavier than the metal they were carved into. Her vision blurred again, but this time the tears didn't fall. Instead, a memory rose up so clearly it stole the air from her lungs. She was small again, too small for the rifle resting against her shoulder. The forest smelled like pine and damp leaves. Her father stood beside her, arms crossed, watching her line up a shot at a target she could barely see. She missed. The bullet kicked dust 2 feet wide. Her stomach had dropped. She remembered that feeling more clearly than the miss itself. The certainty that she'd disappointed him, that she'd failed some invisible test she hadn't even known she was taking. "I'm sorry," she'd said, voice tight. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't sighed. He'd knelt beside her and adjusted her stance with gentle hands, slowed her breathing by matching it with his own. "The world," he'd said quietly, "will tell you to stay down when you mess up. It will tell you that failure is proof you don't belong." He'd tapped the side of her helmet. "But that's not how this works." She took a shaky breath now, sitting on a bathroom floor decades later. "Oh, you don't stay down," he'd continued. "You learn, you adjust, and you take the shot again." She remembered pulling the trigger the second time, the way everything else fell away. The sound, the impact, center mass. He'd nodded once. That was all. She curled her fingers around the pendant now, grounding herself in its edges, its weight. Her father had given it to her 2 weeks before his final deployment. She asked him why. "So you don't forget who you are," he'd said. She closed her eyes. For a long moment, she considered leaving, accepting whatever transfer they offered, walking away before this place stripped her down further, before men like Mercer decided what she was worth. It would be easy, quiet, clean, and it would haunt her forever. Her jaw tightened. She stood up slowly, legs stiff, body aching in ways she didn't bother cataloging. Pain was familiar. It was manageable. What she couldn't manage was the idea of letting this be the story that ended her. She cleaned herself up methodically, washed the mud from her hair, pressed a cloth to her nose until the bleeding slowed, changed into dry clothes. Each small action stitched a little control back into her body. By the time she looked in the mirror again, the woman staring back wasn't calm, but she was focused. "This," she said softly, touching the crooked bridge of her nose, "is not where I stop." Elsewhere, Gunnery Sergeant Victor Mercer slept soundly. He told himself the day had gone exactly as it should have. The female staff sergeant had been exposed, publicly corrected, shown her place. The Marines had seen it. That mattered. He believed deeply in lessons that left marks. In his mind, the mud pit wasn't cruelty. It was tradition. It was proof. He'd been broken there once, too. Had stood shaking in the cold while men older and harder than him decided whether he was worth the uniform. They made him worthy. At least, that's what he believed. He didn't think about the way she'd stood up, about the stillness in her eyes, about the fact that she hadn't argued, hadn't pleaded, hadn't even looked at him. He wrote his recommendation with confidence. Failure to maintain composure. Physical deficiency under stress. Not suited for infantry leadership. He hit submit and leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Somewhere deep down, beneath layers of certainty inherited from another generation, a small voice whispered that something was wrong. He ignored it. At 1500 hours, she stood outside Captain Voight's office, uniform pressed, face blank, nose freshly taped by medical. When the door opened, she stepped inside without hesitation. Voight studied her longer than necessary. Not the injury, not the posture, her eyes. You could transfer, he said finally, quietly. She didn't respond. He folded his hands. Or you could attempt the advanced infantry assessment. Her heartbeat didn't change. When does it begin? She asked. Voight raised an eyebrow. Midnight. She nodded once. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, softer this time. Staff Sergeant, this isn't about proving anything. She paused at the door. Yes, sir, she said evenly. It is. She walked out, pendant resting warm against her chest. Some tests weren't about strength. They were about whether you were willing to stand back up when the world decided you shouldn't. And she had already made that choice. Why did the night feel heavier once the choice was made? Midnight came without ceremony. No speech, no crowd, just darkness pressing down on the base like a held breath. The air was colder than it had been all day, the kind of cold that slipped through fabric and settled into bone. Floodlights cast long shadows across the staging area, turning every movement into something sharp and exposed. She stood alone at the edge of it, adjusting the straps on borrowed gear with fingers that felt steady despite everything. That surprised her. She had expected fear, doubt, a last-minute flicker of regret. And instead, there was only focus. An evaluator handed her a clipboard, voice flat, procedural. Rules, time limits, failure conditions, medical stops. She listened without comment, eyes forward, absorbing everything while giving nothing away. Somewhere behind her, she felt eyes on her. Gunnery Sergeant Mercer stood near the vehicles, arms crossed, posture rigid. He hadn't been invited to observe, but he'd come anyway. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. His presence was loud enough. The horn sounded. She ran. The first miles were deceptive. Her body was still warm from earlier movement, muscles loose enough to cooperate. Her breath found a rhythm quickly. Left, right, inhale, exhale. The pack bounced against her spine, heavy but familiar. Weight had never scared her. It grounded her. By mile 3, the cold began to creep in. By mile 5, the burn set deep in her legs, that slow, spreading ache that warned of limits approaching. She adjusted her stride without thinking, shaving seconds where she could, conserving energy where it mattered. She didn't think about the mud pit. She didn't think about Mercer. She thought about distance, time, the next marker. At mile 7, doubt arrived. It always did. It whispered in a familiar voice. The voice that asked why she kept doing this. Why she kept choosing paths that required suffering just to stand still. Why proving herself never seemed to end. She reached instinctively toward her chest, fingers brushing the pendant through layers of fabric. Second place means you survive. She kept moving. By the time she crossed the line, her lungs burned and her legs trembled, but she didn't slow until an evaluator raised a hand. She bent forward, hands on her knees, breath fogging the air, then straightened when ordered to do so. No praise, no comment, just a nod toward the water. The ocean was black and endless. She stood at the edge, wetsuit half-zipped, listening to the waves break with quiet indifference. The wind cut across the surface, carrying salt and cold that stung her nose. Somewhere out there, a safety boat waited. Somewhere out there was relief. She stepped in anyway. The shock stole her breath instantly. Cold wrapped around her like a vice, squeezing until her chest spasmed. For half a second, instinct screamed at her to retreat, to get out, to stop, and she forced herself to float. Slow the breathing. Control it before it controls you. Stroke by stroke, she moved forward. The water felt thick, resistant, as if it resented her presence. Her arms ached almost immediately. Her nose throbbed with every wave that slapped her face. Halfway through, she faltered. Her breath hitched. Panic flared. The safety boat drifted closer, a dark shape in her peripheral vision. All she had to do was raise her hand. She didn't. She thought of her father in places colder than this, darker than this, injured and still moving because others depended on him. She thought of the bathroom floor, of the decision she'd made. She finished with seconds to spare. They gave her no time to recover. The ruck was heavier now. 70 pounds pressed into her shoulders as she started the forest run. Pine needles crunched underfoot. The path twisted and climbed, roots reaching out like traps in the dark. By mile 4, her thighs burned so badly it felt like something was tearing. By mile 6, her vision narrowed. The world reduced itself to the ground in front of her boots and the sound of her own breathing. At mile 9, her body began to lie to her. Every step felt wrong, too heavy, too slow. Her brain started suggesting small compromises. Slow down just a little. Walk for 30 seconds. No one would notice. She didn't answer the voice. She ran. Somewhere around mile 11, the forest changed. The air felt different, thicker, quieter. She saw him then. Her father stood just off the trail, arms crossed, exactly as he had when she was young. Not smiling, not frowning, just watching. She knew it wasn't real. She also knew it didn't matter. He didn't speak. He never did in these moments. He just fell into step beside her, matching her pace, staying there as if to remind her she wasn't alone, even now. When she crossed the finish line, she stumbled once, caught herself, and turned. The trail was empty. The next phase began without warning. Obstacle course, rope climbs, walls slick with moisture, cargo nets that burned her palms raw. By the second rope, her hands were bleeding again, scabs torn open, grip failing. She hung there for a moment, 18 feet above the ground, arms shaking violently. Below her, an evaluator tapped his watch. She closed her eyes, adjusted her grip by millimeters. They pulled and didn't fall. Night navigation came next. No lights, no GPS, just map, compass, and terrain that swallowed mistakes whole. Swamp water soaked her boots. Thorns tore at her sleeves. Twice she realized she drifted off course and forced herself to stop, breathe, reassess instead of rushing deeper into error. When she found the final checkpoint, relief came not as joy, but as quiet certainty. She was still here. An hour blurred into hour. Exhaustion became a constant companion, sitting heavy behind her eyes. Her thoughts slowed, thickened, but she forced clarity where it mattered. When the medical scenario began, she dropped to her knees beside the mannequin without hesitation, hands moving automatically. A tourniquet, high and tight, an airway, breathing, circulation. Her voice stayed calm as she transmitted the medevac request, even as her arms shook from fatigue. She finished with time to spare. Somewhere nearby, Mercer watched. He had been certain she would break by now, certain she would fail quietly, proving everything he believed without forcing him to confront it. Instead, she kept moving. An hour 32 brought chaos. The simulated ambush unfolded fast. Too fast. Teammates down within seconds. Confusion layered on top of exhaustion. Radios crackling with unfamiliar call signs and procedures designed to overwhelm. She didn't panic. She adapted. Cover first, then casualties, then communication. She worked the problem the way she always had, in pieces, one decision at a time. She suppressed the enemy position while transmitting accurate information, her mind cutting through fatigue with ruthless efficiency. The evaluators exchanged glances. This wasn't textbook. This was instinct forged somewhere else. By hour 44, she entered the shoot house on fumes. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred at the edges. But when the first target appeared, everything narrowed into precision. Breathing, sight picture, trigger. She cleared rooms methodically, never rushing, never hesitating. When she exited into the gray morning light, the world felt unreal, as if she were walking out of a dream she'd been holding together by sheer will. She had done it. She didn't smile. Victory wasn't loud. It was quiet, heavy, earned. And somewhere behind her, a man who had tried to bury her in the mud realized too late that he had only given her something solid to push against. Sometimes survival isn't about winning. It's about refusing to disappear when the world decides you should. Why did the room feel smaller once everyone realized she hadn't failed? Morning light filtered through narrow windows, thin and colorless, like it hadn't decided whether it belonged there. The briefing room smelled of burnt coffee and damp uniforms. Chairs scraped softly as instructors took their seats, the quiet thick with unspoken calculations. This was the moment where effort became verdict, where endurance turned into record. She stood at the back of the room, shoulders squared, hands relaxed at her sides. 44 hours without sleep sat heavy behind her eyes. Every muscle ached with a deep, settled pain that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She welcomed it. Pain meant she was still present, still grounded. Across the room, Gunnery Sergeant Victor Mercer sat rigid in the front row, arms crossed so tightly they looked locked in place. He hadn't slept either, but his exhaustion was different. Hers came from doing. His came from watching something unravel. Captain Voigt stepped to the front, tablet in hand. No preamble, no softening of language. Staff Sergeant Joel Krenner completed all required events within established time standards. The pause. Her name hung in the air. Her performance exceeded baseline criteria in every evaluated category. Mercer shifted. Voight continued, voice even, controlled. Her response during the ambush scenario demonstrated exceptional adaptability under degraded conditions. Her close quarters performance ranked among the highest scores recorded in this program. The silence was absolute now. She felt something stir in her chest. Not pride, not relief, something quieter. Validation without celebration. The kind that didn't need witnesses. Mercer waited for the caveat, the technicality, the reason this wouldn't count. It never came. Voight set the tablet down. This morning, he said, I received communication from Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command. Several instructors straightened. The authorization level required me to confirm my own clearance before reading further. Oh, that did it. Mercer stood abruptly, chair screeching against the floor. This is nonsense, he snapped. Her record is sealed. None of this can be verified. Voight's voice dropped, sharp as glass. Sit down, gunnery sergeant. Mercer didn't. The air felt charged now, humming with something dangerous. Voight continued anyway. Staff Sergeant Krenner served 3 years with a joint special operations element, conducting direct action and intelligence missions in denied areas across multiple countries. A murmur rippled through the room. She participated in 17 classified operations. She was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device under Title 50 authorities. Mercer's face drained of color. She is the daughter of Master Sergeant Raymond Krenner, Voight said, Medal of Honor recipient. That was when the room truly changed. Mercer exploded, words tumbling out in desperation masked as authority. Accusations, claims of fabrication, attacks not just on her but on the dead. Voight didn't raise his voice. He turned to her instead. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "step forward." So she did. Each step felt deliberate, weighted with every mile, every breath, every moment she'd refused to break. She stopped 3 feet from Mercer, close enough for him to see her clearly, close enough that he couldn't look away. Voight gestured gently. "Show them." She reached beneath her collar and drew out the pendant. The silver caught the light as she turned it slowly, revealing the words engraved on the reverse. "Make them remember." She held it there, not as proof, but as truth. The room was utterly still. Mercer stared at the pendant as if it were something dangerous, something alive. Voight's voice hardened. "You assaulted a combat veteran during training. You broke her nose. You falsified documentation to end her career. And when confronted with evidence, you attacked her integrity and her father's honor." Mercer's mouth opened. No sound came out. She spoke then, quietly. "My father taught me that strength isn't about who you can hurt," she said. "It's about who you protect." She stepped closer. "He died saving others. You tried to destroy someone because she threatened your identity." Mercer's eyes flicked away for the first time. Voight finished it. "Gunnery Sergeant Victor Mercer, you are relieved of duty effective immediately." The words landed heavy. 2 military police officers appeared at the door. Mercer stood frozen for a moment. Then he walked out, shoulders hunched, a man suddenly small in a room that had outgrown him. No one spoke. Then one clap echoed through the space. Slow, deliberate. Corporal Desmond Hale stood, hands coming together again and again. Others followed. She didn't move. The applause rolled over her, but it didn't lift her. It settled, anchored. She understood then that vindication wasn't loud. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the mud or the laughter or the night on the bathroom floor. but it changed the ending. When the room finally emptied, she stood alone for a moment longer. The pendant rested warm against her chest. Make them remember. She already had. And the cost of forgetting would never be the same again. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives quietly, after endurance has done its work. Why did the victory feel heavier than the defeat ever had? The base was quieter than she remembered it, not empty, just subdued, like it was holding onto something it didn't quite know how to name yet. Word had spread, but not loudly. It never did. Stories like hers moved through hallways in fragments, whispers, glances that lingered a second too long, a nod that carried more weight than a salute. She noticed the change immediately. Marines who had once looked through her now met her eyes, some quickly, some with something like respect, others with discomfort, as if they were unsure where to place her now that the story they'd accepted no longer fit. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Captain Voigt called her into his office 3 days later. This time there was no tension in his posture, no guarded neutrality, just fatigue and resolve. "You'll have orders soon," he told her. "New assignment, West Coast." She nodded once. "You'll be developing assessment standards," he continued. "Training frameworks, integration protocols." "Understood, sir." Voight hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "You didn't have to do it the way you did." She met his eyes. "Yes, sir, I did." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, accepting that answer for what it was. When she left the office, she didn't feel triumph. She felt responsibility. That weight followed her everywhere over the next few days. In the gym, on the range, through the barracks hallways at night when sleep refused to come. She replayed the mud pit in her mind, not as it had been, but as it could have ended. What if she hadn't stood up? What if she had left quietly? The thought unsettled her more than the memory of Mercer's boots near her head. Late one evening, she found herself walking without a destination, feet carrying her across familiar ground. The training fields were dark now, floodlights off, the silence broken only by distant generators and wind moving through pine needles. She stopped when she recognized the outline ahead of her. The mud pit. It looked smaller without the crowd, without the noise. Just a depression in the earth, scarred by use, holding the imprint of years of men being tested, broken, reshaped. She stood at its edge for a long time. This place had tried to define her, reduce her to a moment of humiliation, a story someone else told. It had failed. Footsteps approached from behind, measured and hesitant. Staff Sergeant. She turned. Corporal Desmond Hale stood a few paces back, hands clasped loosely in front of him, cap tucked under one arm. He looked unsure, like someone stepping into a conversation he didn't know how to start. "Oh, permission to speak freely?" he asked. She nodded. "Oh, my sister enlisted last week," he said. "She wants infantry." She waited. "I didn't know what to tell her," he admitted. "I kept thinking about what happened, about that day." His jaw tightened. "Until the briefing." She looked back at the pit. "She'll face her own challenges," she said. "You can't fight them for her." He swallowed. "I know, but now I know she won't be alone." The words settled between them. He raised his hand in a slow, formal salute, not rushed, not symbolic, held just long enough to mean something. She returned it. When he left, the field felt different, lighter. The next morning, frost coated the ground. The sky was still dark when she returned to the pit one last time. Ice glazed the red clay, catching the first hints of sunrise and turning the surface pale and fragile. She crouched and touched the frozen earth, where her face had been pressed days earlier. Cold, solid, real. She stood as the sun crested the horizon, warming the ground inch by inch, melting what had hardened overnight. That felt right. Later, she loaded her truck in silence. No send-off, no ceremony, just movement forward. As she drove out, she touched the pendant beneath her collar, feeling the familiar weight settle against her chest. Make them remember. She didn't know exactly what she would build yet, only that she would build something that lasted, something that meant no one else would have to prove their worth by surviving humiliation. Some lessons didn't need repetition. They needed change. And she was finally in a position to make that happen. Sometimes the strongest legacy isn't what you endure. It's what you prevent others from having to endure again. Why did the road ahead feel more uncertain than any battlefield she had ever known? The tires hummed against the highway as California unfolded in long, sun-bleached miles. Mountains rose and fell in the distance, indifferent witnesses to whatever she was becoming. She drove with the window cracked, letting the dry air cut through the lingering smell of motor oil and dust inside the cab. No radio, no music, just the steady rhythm of movement. Forward had always been easier when someone else defined it. In the past, there had been missions, coordinates, clear objectives, people whose lives depended on her doing exactly what she had been trained to do, exactly when it needed to be done. Now there was something else waiting, something less defined, harder to measure. Responsibility without an enemy. Camp Pendleton appeared gradually, sprawling and alive, a city built for preparation and repetition. She parked, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel. The pendant pressed warm against her chest. She touched it once, not for strength this time, but for grounding. This was real. Her new office was small, bare walls, a metal desk scarred with the history of other occupants, a whiteboard still faintly marked with half-erased diagrams from someone else's abandoned plans. She stood in the doorway and took it in without judgment. This was where change started, quietly, without applause. The first weeks passed slowly. She listened more than she spoke, observed how assessments were run, how standards were explained and sometimes quietly bent. She watched instructors repeat phrases they'd inherited without questioning their meaning, watched young Marines struggle, not because they lacked ability, but because no one had taught them how to fail without breaking. At night, she wrote, not reports, not memos, notes. What had almost broken her, what had sharpened her, what had never needed to be cruel to be effective. She stripped everything down to essentials, physical standards that tested capability without humiliation, evaluations that measured decision-making under pressure, not bravado, feedback that corrected without destroying. Some instructors resisted. This is how we've always done it, they said. She didn't argue. She let results speak. Slowly, things changed. A recruit who would have been dismissed for freezing during a live fire exercise was given a second run. After coaching, after breathing, after understanding the mistake, he passed the second time, not because standards were lowered, but because fear had been addressed instead of mocked. A female Marine completed an assessment and walked off the course exhausted but upright, eyes steady, not shattered by the experience. She sought her out afterward, voice quiet. Thank you, she said, for not letting them break us just to see if we bend. That night, alone in her quarters, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. This was harder than combat. There was no adrenaline to mask the weight of it, no clear end, just the steady accumulation of choices that would shape lives she might never see again. Sometimes late at night, doubt returned. She wondered if Mercer had been right about one thing. That tradition, once altered, lost something essential. She wondered if she was strong enough to carry the backlash she knew would come. She wondered if she was building something real, or just reacting to pain she hadn't fully released. On those nights, sleep didn't come easily. She would sit with the pendant in her hand, tracing the familiar engraving, letting memory surface without fighting it. Not the mud pit anymore. That had lost its edge, but quieter moments. Her father cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table. His voice low, careful when he spoke about things that mattered. Strength, he'd once said, isn't about how much you can endure. It's about knowing when endurance stops being useful. She understood that now. Months passed. The program took shape, slowly, deliberately. It didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. What it did was produce Marines who were capable, confident, and unafraid to ask questions without feeling small for doing so. One afternoon, during a break between assessments, she walked past a training field and heard laughter. Not mocking, not sharp, just relief. A group of Marines cooling down, sharing water, comparing mistakes without shame. She stopped and watched from a distance. This was what she'd wanted. Not recognition, not vindication. Balance. A place where strength didn't require cruelty to prove itself. Near the end of her first year, she received a letter, handwritten. The envelope was worn, creased like it had been carried around before being sent. It was from Corporal Hale. He wrote about his sister, about her first training cycle, about how she'd struggled and adapted and refused to quit, about how she talked about a staff sergeant out west who had changed how things were done. She doesn't know you, he wrote, but she knows what you stood for. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. That night she walked alone along the perimeter of the base. The sky was clear, stars sharp against the dark. Somewhere beyond the fence, waves broke against the shore, steady and endless. She thought about the woman she'd been in that mud pit. Cold, bleeding, surrounded by laughter. She thought about how close she'd come to believing it. And she realized something then that settled into her bones with quiet certainty. They hadn't changed her. They'd revealed her. The road ahead would never be easy. It wasn't meant to be. But it was hers now, shaped not by the need to prove herself, but by the choice to protect others from unnecessary harm. She stopped, turned her face toward the ocean, and breathed. Somewhere behind her, new Marines were training, failing, learning, standing back up. And somewhere ahead, the legacy her father had given her was finally taking a form that didn't require silence or shadows to survive. Sometimes dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand space. Sometimes dignity simply stands up when the world expects it to stay down, and then quietly makes sure fewer people are ever pushed there again.